items in Grow Garden, but there's actually a ton that never got added, like this dragon sapling or even this ice cream bean. And today we're going to look at every unreleased item that ever made it to the game, starting with the creepiest plant ever, because this flower never made it into the game, and honestly, I can see why. It's called the Noble Flower, and it was designed with a disturbing smile right in the middle of it. Yeah, imagine walking into your garden and seeing your plant smiling back at you. That's not peaceful, it's terrifying. Its seed was supposed to look kind of like the traveler's fruit seed, and when fully grown, the plant would have sold for around 20,000 shekels. Not exactly a crazy amount for something this rare. However, the flower also had these eerie shades of blue, which were meant to make it look creepier, but it low-key just reminds me of a sandwich. Everyone knows that Grow Garden has a habit of naming plants after silly things, but this time they might have gone a little too far, because there's actually a plant that was literally named after a dessert, and not just any dessert either. It's called the ice cream bean, which sounds delicious until you realize it doesn't even look like ice cream at all. In fact, the only picture we've ever seen of it is an unfinished model where it isn't even fully grown yet, and instead of looking like an ice cream, it just looks like, well, a bean. But here's when things start to get interesting, because this was actually meant to be a mythical plant, which makes it super rare, except right now the only way you can actually get it is if you got admin commands. So unless you're secretly on a dev team, you're probably never touching this thing. However, the name alone has players thinking it might be a hint for a full-on dessert update, where your garden turns into a candy shop, or even something wild like a Feastables collab, where you're literally growing Mr. Beast chocolate bars. This might be one of the craziest looking plants in Grow Garden. Everyone knows mushrooms in Grow Garden usually aren't worth that much, but this one mushroom completely breaks the pattern, and instead of looking like food, it looks like something straight out of the year 3000. This is the America mushroom, and it was supposed to be a legendary plant that was released during the 4th of July event. However, somewhere along the way, it looks like the idea got scrapped, and instead we ended up with the firework flower taking its place. And that's where things get even crazier, because the American mushroom isn't even attainable anymore, meaning the only time players ever got to see it in action was during a Flamingo video, where he admin abused and somehow managed to grow the plant himself. It looks so insane that if a squad of robots marched out of it, I don't think anyone would even be surprised. However, there are actually a bunch of other unreleased plants in Grow Garden, and the strangest part is that nobody even knows what they look like. For example, there's this plant called the Spirit Lantern, which was supposed to be added during the Beanstalk Part 2 update, but for some reason it ended up getting scrapped, and its design has never been shown, which means the only people who've ever seen it are the devs and the admins. But that's not the only mystery tied to the Beanstalk update, because there have also been rumors about a plant called the Cool Beanstalk, and honestly, even if it never got added, you gotta admit that's a pretty cool name. But the same thing goes for another unreleased plant known as the Sinister Drip, which definitely sounds like something that belongs in a horror update. And then there's the Torch Flare, which is still completely unknown at this point, but might eventually make its way into a future update. I think Grow Garden might have a little problem when it comes to bugs, because while the Dragonfly was already super hard to obtain, there's actually another pet that never made it into the game. This was the Firefly, which at one point was supposed to be added, but for some reason Jandal decided to hold it back. From the looks of it, the Firefly was pretty normal design-wise, but what made it special is that it was planned to be a mythical category pet. And here's where it gets interesting, because players who actually saw it claimed that its passive ability gave your plants the shocked mutation. That's a big deal, since shocked plants sell for way more than regular ones. So in the end, the Firefly was never released, and maybe that's for the best, because Jandal probably didn't want the entire economy getting fried by one glowing bug. Did you know there's actually a secret plant hiding in the garden guide? Most players don't even pay attention to the garden guide, but if you look closely, you'll spot a plant that doesn't even exist in game. That is called the Dragon Sapling, and it was originally supposed to release during the Zen Flare update, but instead of giving us the sapling, the dev swapped it out and replaced it with the Zen Flare plant instead. The Dragon Sapling was meant to be a legendary plant, which makes it even stranger that it never got added, because legendary plants don't exactly get thrown away every day. Yet here's the best part, despite scrapping it, Jandal actually forgot to remove it from the garden guide, so it's been sitting there this whole time, teasing players with something they can never actually grow. Everyone hates pumpkins in Grow Garden, but what if I told you there's actually a rare version of the pumpkin that never made it into the game? This mysterious plant is called the Log Pumpkin, and the weirdest part is, it doesn't even look like a pumpkin. In fact, the only picture we have of it makes it look more like a giant worm than anything else, which is honestly way worse. And because it was never released, there's no data on how players were supposed to obtain it, or even what update it was meant to appear in. Right now, the only thing we can do is speculate, and the most likely theory is that it's being saved for a future update. But let's be honest here, even if it does eventually get added, ain't no way I'm putting a giant worm pumpkin in my garden. Everyone knows the Busy Bee event was a massive success for Grow Garden, since it gave players tons of strong pets and seeds. However, there was actually one pet on the list that never made it into the game, and that was the Golden Bee. At first glance, it just looked like a normal bee, but once you hear about its passive ability, you'll understand exactly why it was scrapped. This little guy had the power to pollinate pollinator plant and turn it gold. And if that wasn't crazy enough, it also had a random chance to turn a harvested fruit into gold too. That basically meant unlimited profit because golden plants sell for way more than normal ones. And here's the wild part, it was also one of only 4 pets in the game that could give plants growth variant mutations, which made it ridiculously broken. What's the biggest plant in Grow a Garden? Most players would probably guess the burning bud, but there's actually another plant that could give it a serious challenge for the title. It's called the mutant carrot, and from the one picture we have, it basically looks like a regular carrot, just blown up to ridiculous proportions. This plant hasn't been added to the game yet, but the size difference alone is crazy. For perspective, a normal carrot in Grow a Garden is about 5 studs tall, while the mutant carrot measures a massive 29 studs at the base. And if you pair that with multiple sprinklers, yeah, you're basically growing a skyscraper out of dirt. The mutant carrot has even appeared in the garden guide before, teasing players that it might show up in a future update, but until then, it's just sitting there in the files, waiting to turn someone's peaceful little garden into a full-on giant vegetable patch. However, there is another unreleased pet that is fire, literally. It's called the red dragon, and the funny part is that it doesn't look scary at all. In fact, it looks more like the kind of dragon that walks up asking for head pats than one that's supposed to breathe fire. This pet was originally supposed to release really early in the game, but the idea was completely scrapped. Somehow though, its images still ended up leaking into Grow a Garden's official Discord, giving players a peek at what could have been. The red dragon was placed in the common category, which might make you think it wasn't very strong, but that's where things get interesting, because its passive ability was actually so good that it later got copied and reused for the Scorched Owl. So yeah, the red dragon wasn't bad at all, but the only way you're ever getting it now is if you're close friends with Jandal himself. This might be one of the creepiest pets ever designed for Grow a Garden, and honestly, I'm kind of glad it never got released. It was originally planned for the Zen update, but the design looks like something pulled straight out of a fever dream. The Sachinoko was a rare tier pet that was supposed to hatch from the corrupt Zen egg, and the model we've seen of it looks absolutely ridiculous. Now, in real life, the Sachinoko comes from Japanese folklore, where it's described as a strange snake-like creature, sometimes even part dragon. But Grow a Garden's version, yeah, it looks a lot less like a dragon, and more like they just traced over a leech. Still, despite the weird design, its passive ability wasn't bad at all, since it gave players an increased chance at getting a lucky harvest, which would have been kinda useful. But wait, we're not done with the Zen update pets just yet, because this next one might honestly be Grow a Garden's biggest fumble. This is Mizuchi, a divine tier pet that was supposed to hatch from the corrupt egg, and the reason it never got released is pretty obvious once you hear how broken it was. Mizuchi looked like a sleek sea dragon, and it was inspired by Japanese mythology, where Mizuchi is described as a sea serpent and even a god of the water. Pretty cool reference, right? But the real problem wasn't the design, it was the passive ability. You see, if you sold a plant that had the wet or drench mutation, Mizuchi had a chance to copy a random mutation from that plant and transfer it to any fruit in your garden. And that meant you could basically duplicate the rarest, most valuable mutations over and over again, completely breaking the game's balance.